Everybody, thanks so much for being here. Up in the public gallery as well, we've got Larry Jones from Eston, just in case we're wondering who's there. Thank you for coming as well. If I just read through our usual notices to start. So, may I welcome everyone to the meeting. Just to confirm, as a council, we welcome the use of the Welsh language within our public meetings, but I can confirm that we have not received any notification or requests to use Welsh today. Therefore, this meeting will be conducted in English only. As a reminder, can I ask you to recall that this meeting is being webcast. Therefore, can I ask that you turn off or silence your mobile phones and ensure you speak clearly into the microphones. If applicable, in case of a fire drill, we'll follow the signs, the green signs on the doors down to exit the building. Can I also remind all members to sign the attendance register and confirm if any apologies have been received for this meeting. Do we know of any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. We've got apologies from Councillor Glencairn.
Do we know of any others who've said personally? No? Okay, if we move on to item 2, then declarations of interest. If I bring in legal, you can advise us.
Thank you, Chair. I don't anticipate any declarations in relation to the items on the agenda today, members. The main reported agenda item 5 is, of course, the EAS business plan, and this is a document that is an overarching document relating to the whole authority area, so I don't anticipate there being any declarations arising. If during the course of discussion of that item any particular schools are mentioned in great detail, then members who have personal connections to those schools may at that point wish to declare a personal interest, but frankly I don't anticipate it. And just to remind members, if an interest does arise, could they please record it at the appropriate point in the attendance register. There's a sheet there for declaring the interest. So unless members have any questions for me, that's my advice, Chair. Thank you very much.
Any questions or anything you want to declare that we don't have? Okay. If we move on to agenda item 3 then, minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of November. These related to the report we received on attendance and exclusions. Can I ask you to scan through for accuracy, first off? Has there been any issues that anyone wants to bring up? If not, are we happy to accept them as an accurate record? Yeah, we're happy? Brilliant. Okay then, agenda item 4 is the action sheet. We can have an update, members, on any actions outstanding. I think there's one there which is from October, and I was going to ask him if he has a verbal update for us.
Thank you. This was the issue about the Children and Young People's, the proposed partnership arrangements for Children and Young People's Board and the Public Service Board. They came in October, and the recommendation there was obviously about the plan should be put together with all stakeholders and should be presented to elected members before acceptance by the PSB. Chair, what we covered in that meeting was that each of the 4 strands were looking at developing their own improvement suggestion plans that was going to go back to the board. Those plans are coming to the point where they're nearly ready, so they can come back here, and we've discussed maybe in the past how maybe that could be shared in between meetings, and then if it needs to be prioritised, could be. Just to offer reassurance, we have obviously consulted with Children and Young People as part of that, so Rhiannon's been to the Youth Forum and they've been feeding in, and clearly one of the components of that plan is to establish a Children and Young People's Parliament in Torvine, and that works well advanced. We're hoping to take that particular proposal, which I think might be of interest to this committee, to an upcoming PSB, so we probably need to have a discussion about, I think the committee might want to see that proposal before it goes to the PSB and feed into it. So I think there's a timing issue for us just to agree, maybe outside the meeting or after the meeting today, just how we can achieve that so the committee gets a chance to look at it before it goes to the board. Okay.
Members, any questions on that one or any of the other actions on the sheet? Any questions? Nope. Okay then, we move on to the main agenda item then, item 5. This is the EAS business plan for 1920. So the purpose of this report is to consider the full contents of the draft EAS business plan and to determine whether the plan enables appropriate support for schools to improve and for all pupils across Torvine to reach their potential. So may I welcome Julian. I'm very sorry, Julian, I'm going to start off. Yes.
Maximum score and Scrabble.
That's it. When we said earlier, Julian, you don't need a second name. We all know you. Principal Challenge Advisor, Ed Price, Challenge Advisor, Service Strategic and Policy Lead, and Sharon Davis, Head of Learning, to the meeting. Obviously doing that, we all know as well. So over to you guys.
We have endeavoured to ensure that through the consultation process, which is the main point of this meeting today, that we do take on board the sort of the local nuances, if you like, of the 5 authorities. Although I think we're all acutely aware, there is a massive national agenda now of change, and a lot of the changes moving forward contained in the business plan centre around moving towards the implementation of the national mission, and the implications of successful futures. So there's a lot around that, but obviously we still need to focus on the really important, I wouldn't say that the other important, but the real focus is about every individual counts in every local authority and in every school. So it's about highlighting then those sort of local nuances within each school, in particular on the vulnerable learners. So I think when you read through the plan, even the high-level summary parts of the plan, I think the main thrusts are obviously around curriculum change, the accountability measures as they roll out, and they are literally changing week on week as we speak, which does add another layer of confusion sometimes, and it's trying to unpick that to give the steer to ourselves, local authorities, and to the schools, and in the professional learning that we offer as well. What we've done this year is, and in fact it's something we've always done, is we've always been very reflective as a region and very self-critical in terms of the areas that we need to move or improve on moving forward. And I know several of you sit on various other bodies, which governing bodies and head teachers groups, the consultation groups. We've got JEG, obviously, where your cabinet member and Dermot sits on. Obviously, the scrutiny committee, the company board. What we try to do is reflect on best practice. But what we've done, started doing last year and is rolling out, we funded directly, as all regions are as well, for action-based research on whether what we intend to do and planning to do actually works. So I think, when we look at school improvement, it's quite simply what's going well, what's not going well, and if it's not going well, what are we going to do differently? And we try to have that same approach as a region. So we've actually engaged several external bodies and are continuing to work with them this year. For instance, one of the ones moving forward is our peer working, school-to-school working, which is now providing the cornerstone of most of the school support, and I'm sure we'll come back to that later on during the meeting. But that's come as a consequence of external review and provision. It's been honed again this year, and we're actually rolling out several models of that in a pilot again this year, funded, as I said, through the funding we get through Welsh Government, so that we can establish a range of working practices that will best suit all the schools across the region, so they can choose the most appropriate way of working. So it is a massive time of change, curriculum-wise, in the approaches to that, ensuring that, professional learning-wise, and ensuring that the leaders and the teachers and the teaching assistants and everybody else associated with it, and even local authority members and cabinet members trying to keep up with it. For years we've got used to talking about benchmarking and things like this, and that was almost the security blanket. But so moving forward, it's big changes, but they're going to be centred around there. And I look forward to your questions throughout the meeting on that.
And Chair, just to add to that, on page 21 of the bundle, you'll see on the summary at the front of the report, the business plan really picks up the strategic priorities that some members will have looked at through the scrutiny activity when we were looking at service planning. And I think it resonates through because it reflects the national mission statement in any case. But for us, clearly, categorisation last week, we know we have an improving picture, particularly at primary. We're seeing some good turnaround there, an increase in the number of schools categorised as green. But the variability of outcomes in secondary schools remains a significant concern for us. We know that the performance of our preschool meal learners, boys in particular as well, isn't where it should be. So in addition to all of the other stuff we're doing around the professional learning offer, we're also making sure that we don't lose sight of the things that really for us are of significant concern. So hopefully as we go through the plan and we can tease out your questions, how are we going to make sure in the middle of all these different changes that we focus in on the individual outcome for the individual learner, as Julian said, and that we don't let anyone take their eye off that ball, because that's what this is all about. How does it feel? What's it like to be a learner in Torvine? Do you as a learner and your parents, do you feel, and your carers, do you feel that you're getting a good deal? Is that good enough? So whatever the changes are, whatever the accountability framework looks like, and I was in a meeting with Roger yesterday on the accountability outcomes, but I'm not sure I'm entirely clear yet myself, even though I was in the meeting. We focus on the learner. We focus on what it means like for them. And I'm confident that the business plan reflects that priority, those priorities for us.
Who wants to start then? I think we've all got plenty of questions.
Can I kick off with one? After attending a governor training session last week, and I've done data training with Ed on a number of occasions, I did secondary school data training last week, which was moved to Green Meadow School, but it was run by a former primary school head teacher. My question, probably to Julian, being an expert in secondary education, what other secondary education does the EAS have? Expertise do they have?
Can you clarify?
Yeah.
In terms of what other expertise?
Yes, I will, because there's a number of people involved in the organisation that have a lot of primary expertise.
All right, sorry.
And attending a secondary school training to be told that the person running it was a primary head teacher and didn't have a lot of experience with secondary schools was a bit disappointing.
Okay, I come on to parts of that. I think we use the expertise of the best people interchangeably when it comes to primary and secondary, and there are lots of things that both phases can learn from each other if the people are right. That's the most important aspect. We do have a range of challenge advisors. Every challenge advisor has been a secondary head. We do rely on a number of consultants who we carefully quality assure the work of and manage, and you will know from yourself that there has been change in those areas as well. So we get the right people into position. For secondary schools and challenge advisors, it is secondary heads. Certain other aspects of work, there's cross-phase learning, I think.
I think the other thing I would add there is increasingly, I think the badge of primary and secondary head, it's just about good leadership and good understanding, and good leadership generating good quality teaching and learning for the pupils in the class. And I think that, I'm speaking as an ex-secondary head, as you know, there are many a good lesson that primary heads could teach secondary heads in approaches to teaching and learning. So I think, whilst it may well have been a primary head, they were more than well qualified to actually deliver a data session. So that's the only thing I would say. But in terms of formal secondary school support, then all our challenge advisors have a significant secondary school experience, and myself obviously in the overarching role for the whole of the region as the secondary lead as well. So we've all been secondary heads or senior leaders, so there's that experience to fall back on.
Just sort of staying on Rose's theme, I'm asking because I don't know. So we're talking about support for secondary. When I was looking at some of the categorisation stuff, when I looked across the whole region, 63% of
the secondary schools within the region were either in the red or amber category. But then when I looked at the other consortia for other parts of Wales, it was significantly lower. And I know that we got different demographics and all that kind of stuff, and, you know, different areas will be different for different reasons. But is the capacity within the EAS to offer the support for secondary? Because I look at the primary, and the primary seems really good, and I'm not in any way diminishing the progress that's been made and the improvement that's been made. It just seems significantly different to any of the other areas, and just particularly in that primary area. I mean, when I looked at others, it's sort of between 23 and 26% for the other consortia in those two categories, but then we're at 63%. Why? And how are we tackling that?
I'm going to split the response into two things, because we've actually done a piece of work on this, because the data that you see, shall we say, is not that reliable, and we'll prove it in a moment.
Yeah.
But first things first, the secondary schools, if you think about the journey that the secondary schools in Torfaen have been on, okay, going all the way back to Schools Challenge Cymru, so you've got to think that three of them are starting from being in the bottom, to use a very bad phrase, 40 schools in the whole of Wales. So there was a journey for them to be on. If you have a look at the secondary sector there now, we have accurately categorised those schools in terms of support. Let's not forget, categorisation in its inception was all about the level of support, not whether it was a bad school if it was red or a good school if it was green. It was about the level of support. So before the regions came, as the regions came into existence, 3 out of your 6 schools were already requiring high levels of support, and they'd been on a journey. Layered on top of that, the difference between the primary and secondary quite often comes down to quality of leadership. It's a much smaller organisation to turn around, and leadership becomes more intrinsically important the bigger the organisation. We've had significant churn in your secondary leadership as well. So if you think of that, we've got St Albans with a new head. You've got Aberystwyth with a fairly new head. So you've got all that layered on top as well. But basically, those schools are now starting to move. Okay, so if you have a look at where we had red schools and schools in significant improvement categories, some of those have now started to move, and they either come out of the category or they've gone from red to amber. So they're beginning to gather that momentum, because basically what we've had to do is go right the way back to root and branch and develop very, very basic processes to be able to even quality assure what was going on in the classroom. Once that's happening, you can develop what's going on in the classroom, and then once the classroom starts to really impact on the learning, then we get progress. And at the moment, I think what we've got is an improving picture, but you've still got some disconnect sometimes between standards and the quality of teaching. And it's getting that message across to school leaders. Now, I'll come back to the bit about the regional one, because there is no comparative data regionally, so we can't compare one region with another. I suppose the only thing you could do is go back and look at the Eston reports of the 4 regions if you wanted to do that, okay? And I'll allow you to do that, but, I'm confident in our Eston outcomes. But Ed?
Just to add, first of all, completely agree with you, there are too many red and amber schools.
Absolutely.
But we believe that we're very accurate in the way that we judge those schools, and it's a very thorough and robust process. Currently, in the judgments with primary schools, there has been far more peer-to-peer working on an invitation basis for previous years. Voluntary basis, we need to move more of our secondary schools to be willing to put their hand up, the leaders there, to work peer-to-peer on that. When I look at the data, and this is where I have confidence in our systems, it's quite complex, but when you look at the link and correlation between Key Stage 4 standards in our secondary schools, they match the way we categorise our schools. And that's doesn't correlate, how do I put it? It doesn't correlate entirely across Wales.
Okay, can I ask following on from that really, my big concern is around transition from primary to secondary. So that's not just the process itself. We also seem to have very different approaches. So at primary level, for example, I'm seeing lots of innovative work, lots of, you know, quite radical ideas. But then at secondary, you go into a secondary class and I'm seeing kids just sat down reading Dickens, you know. We don't seem to have that same follow through. And, you know, what I think is showing.
Absolutely. Really astute observation, and I think this is another one of the key drivers. I don't think not just across the region, but across Wales. You know, transition has always been about the child with special learning needs or attendance needs, so it's almost a well-being issue rather than the quality of learning. We forgot that, you know, they're coming up to secondary schools quite often as a highly capable learner. So how we're addressing that, the Welsh Government has introduced a series of cluster grants. So schools are now funded for cluster-based projects. So the secondary school working with their cluster primaries, not on well-being, actually on teaching and learning. And we've got some examples of that. In Torfaen, I can quote, for instance, Westmont have been doing some work with some of their primary schools, which actually involves some of their teachers going out to primary schools, primary school teachers coming in, joint planning. So we're starting to get the breakdown of that barrier. So it's almost, if you like, a seamless transition in terms of teaching and learning, and not a transition because I'm now 11 years of age, I'm off to the secondary school, and I've got to start from a very basic level. So I think that there is a change in heart and mindset, and that is starting to come through in secondary schools because of the need for sustainable change at Key Stage 4 as well, around the skills agenda. So there's cluster group working. We've also, I mentioned earlier on, some of the peer working pilots we've very, very specifically put together with Professor Mick Waters, who is going to write a report for the region, which obviously will all come out to on the effectiveness of this and the way forward with that. But we've carefully constructed some of these groups, so we've actually got some of the groups are a low-performing secondary being fed by high-performing primaries. So why is there the disconnect there? And likewise, so we've been very, very clever in moving forward in trying to think of how we can run these pilot projects with these schools and then come up with, if you like, a process or a format of a way forward of going across the region, but particularly in Torfaen, because that's why we're here today, so that we can answer that very question and we can talk to all our secondary schools and primary schools about the best way forward, other than just talking about well-being and attendance.
If I could add two small points onto that. Julia mentioned the research work that we do. One of the research papers that we commissioned last year was Masters of Metropolitan University to look at the early impact of cluster working. That report's available on our website if you're interested in that. And we use many of the recommendations from that to inform this business plan moving forward with cluster working. The second very minor point with the cluster working is the grant planning tools, if you're governors, that many of you may be aware of. There is a clustered grant planning tool. So rather than the bureaucracy of all the funding going to one school and then it being distributed onwards, schools let us know at the start where they want the money to go, and our systems take a lot of the bureaucracy out of that.
Just to add to that as well, one of the things we've been keen to do with the head teachers group, because they meet on a regular basis throughout the year, is to make sure that heads now feel a bit more confident in coming forward and giving case studies themselves and sharing that expertise and sharing that learning as part of those meetings, which the last couple of meetings in particular we've heard from members of staff, not from the heads, but from people in the classroom saying this is what we've done, this is what we learned across the clusters from the secondary and the primaries, and that really joined up working, being shared in a very organic way, in a very real way, with heads interrogating, well, how did that work for you? Would that work for me? And we're seeing, I think, really good engagement now from schools in expecting to share that learning in an ongoing basis. But more to be done. We accept that. I should mention for vulnerable learners, though, we already have a very clear transition process that's been in place, that's supported by the psychology service and by ALN, and we ensure that schools are looking at all vulnerable learners, and that process takes place well before those youngsters move on, whether they're statemented or not, and we support schools in making sure that they've got the support they need, they understand the information they need to make that transition effective.
Can I just add on at what Dermot was saying with the head teachers? In those forums, during the meetings, it's an opportunity then for other schools. It goes beyond cluster across the authority then during coffee time and things, you can see the positive engagement going on then, and that it goes beyond the cluster.
Are they all attended, those meetings?
Yes, with both secondary and there's a secondary and primary rep that both Dermot and I meet beforehand, the week before, to look at the pre-agenda. They're well attended, and then what they've decided now is the bulk of the meeting is with all the heads in together, and then the last half hour or hour, depending on the agenda items, are split into secondary priorities and primary, because sometimes there are various different things that they need to discuss.
Okay. Looking at the business plan then, one of the questions we wrote down was, what lessons did you learn from the previous business plan? How is this different? How do you expect it to, to work?
In terms of the lessons, I just feel that one of the main messages that's come across is last year across the region was introduced a schools causing concern meeting where all the directors meet with the PCAs and we discuss schools where there are various issues, and then we agree actions and we monitor them. And I think one of the big things that's come through, and one of the big lessons, is the earlier the intervention, the better. I think that this is the real thing. It's not about a knee-jerk reaction to something, because it is about making sure that you have that substantive database to make those judgments on. Otherwise, you continually have to relaunch things and track it back. But one of the big things was around the earlier the intervention in terms of support for a school, whether it be around leadership or teaching and learning or whatever, or well-being, the better for the school and for the pupils in the school. Another one is around the peer group work, and that seems to have, the pilot went really, really well, and that's why we're rolling it out even further. You've got the learning school networks as well. What we've contained in, and I know this is in relation to a finance question as well, but I think when a lot of consortia were set up, a lot of people two-peed across from the old advisory services from the authorities, and you ended up with a region with a big staff. I think we're 44% smaller now in terms of actual core salaried staff than we were when the region was set up. And I think what's happened is, at a very, very strategic, well-planned level, is putting the right people in the right posts to deal with things. So some of the other positive things moving forward, we've got well-being leads and so on, but the big thing around the school support was, it's not about taking people out to school quite often, putting them on a day's course, and then expecting them to go back and have a big impact. Because normally when you go back, you're teaching 5 lessons a day, you haven't got time to implement anything. So the role of the learning network schools now, we invited all schools to bid into this, and then it went through a very strict quality assurance process. Because if I'm a school that is in need of support, let's say around science and technology, for instance, I know that if I'm going to go to your school, I want to be confident that you've got the credibility to help me with it. And I think what we had in the past, we had sort of 4 or 5 schools whose name kept cropping up all the time, and it was a well-worn path in the carpet to these schools, and then you start worrying about the capacity. Whereas this year, there are more LNS schools, and I think that's a reflection, on the improving standards in the region. But it's really nice when you see some of those schools helping, and the impact that they're having on the other schools, because it's teachers talking to other teachers, it's leaders talking to other leaders in school. Rather than just coming up and saying, well, here's the template, this is how you go about it, without having the chance. So the LNS schools, I think that's been a massive one.
Yeah, with the LNS schools, they were very sort of subject area focused in many ways in the first year. There is the category of an LNS good school, so a high quality school for leadership in many areas. Some of those schools have recently been on journeys from red to green themselves over time, and they're almost better placed in a way to support other head teachers and other leadership teams on that same journey. With the LNS programme as well, I keep harking back to the research, but that was one of the areas that was externally reviewed last year. We again fed many of that reports available on the website. we fed many of the recommendations into the programmes for this year and into next year's business plan as well.
And I think if you look through the plan, because sometimes it would be nice if plans were able to organise it just under what's new titles.
Yeah.
You know, but I think going through there, if you have a look, vulnerable learners in FSM have always been a very high priority across Wales, in every authority and in nearly every school. But now moving forward, they are explicitly linked to standards. You know, you will see throughout, whether it's the overarching business plan or the annex, explicitly linked. Funding is linked to the level of the required needs now as well, moving forward. There's a funding for a vulnerable learner lead in every school now as well, which we've managed to acquire grant funding. So every school we've managed to procure it so that we're encouraging them to appoint a vulnerable learner lead in every school. And that will include then providing professional learning for them as well. You know, it's all well and good giving somebody a title, but can they do the job? And I think that's important. So that's going to go hand in hand in it. In the secondary schools, as we know, we've talked about our secondary schools. I won't say being the main focus, because it's every child counts and every school counts, but obviously that's the area where, you know, progress has been less noticeable, then let's call it that. But basically there's a shift to teaching and learning across all subjects, whereas in the past, now with the new measures that are coming through, and you know, we're talking about accountability, the beauty of the new CAP 9 measure is that although the core of it is going to be best English, best maths, best science, it's on a point score, and because you need 6 others, so it's not just about taking people out of history or French to give them extra English because they needed the maths and the, so it's now and it's every child, so it's not just CD borderline. Because if I can convert a pupil who is on a G to an F or an F to an E, those points count. So I think that there's a real shift in focus there. So for instance, in our provision now, our provision will be supporting across all subjects, with a focus across all subjects. So it's this subtle shift away. Don't get me wrong, maths and English are still massive because they're still part of the core for CAP 9. And if you think of the skills that young people need to be successful, they need to be able to do the maths, they need to be, you know, literate and so on. So it's not instead of, this is additional to. We've implemented the Excellence in Teaching and Leadership Framework as a self-evaluation development tool for all schools. And I do believe most, if not nearly all schools are using it now as part of their own self-evaluation processes to drive up the standards of teaching and learning.
In the business plans for next year, the key is the training and support from schools who use it successfully in the past, so that it's practitioners teaching practitioners how to use it. That's been facilitated in the business plan as well.
And I think the other thing, although this is a general thing and not necessarily a specific comment for Torfaen, and I want to make that clear for them, is about the earlier intervention. You know, it's about us providing the detail to enable local authorities to intervene sooner in its use of statutory powers where appropriate. So, if you like, that's the what's new moving forward, in addition to all the other changes that's going on.
Chair, very briefly, I mean, just picking on a couple of things from what Julian said, and in light of an Andrew statement that came out that caused a little bit of a kerfuffle, one of the things I think that's been really good in Torfaen is our schools, the pioneer schools and the whole schools network in the preparations for the new curriculum. I think we've seen really good progress in Torfaen, really good levels of engagement, and a state of readiness that's really moved on significantly over the last 9 months. So I think that's really worth noting as well. I think there really is clarity for schools in terms of expectations, in terms of grants, and you've mentioned some of the tools that are available. So heads have got good support, and that's improved over the last year. And then allied to that, a very clear professional learning offer that's comprehensive, that hopefully makes sense to everyone, from governors right the way through to TAs as well, in everybody in school. And I think that's improving, and there's further improvement coming up. And to pick on the point that Julian raised about vulnerable learners, the business plan's written at a point in time, but it doesn't mean we don't continue to develop in between. So it's a snapshot when it's written. And one of the things we've built on in discussions, and we have another development day coming up, is we've done some really good work in making sure that the local authorities are consistent in how they use their statutory powers, for example. And Schools Cause and Concerns helped us do that, but we've realised we really do need to look at how we can further build on some of the architecture in that work to pull in more rich resource from the local authorities looking at vulnerable learners. Our next step is to look at, well, how do we make sure we can go even further in sharing that intelligence and also offering each other a bit of professional challenge about, well, have we thought about this, have we thought about that? So that's not writ large in this plan, but it's part of what we're doing next as well. And that's literally coming up next week, the week after. Okay.
And I think, Chair, I'll come back later, but if I don't remind me, because it is part of what's new for next year. But I think it might answer, it may come up in a question, I'm unsure about how committees like this and local authorities judge progress now in education, because obviously, the always core data sets, as we've known and got used to understanding and being able to ask her, well, obviously they're gone. So I've got some comments I'll make later on, if you remind me, Chair, on about the additional support we've been providing to local authorities and members and the types of information that we've been providing about your schools to allow you to make those progress judgments and allow you to challenge us as well, to challenge your schools, but to challenge us as a region.
I just wanted to comment on well, it was all great to hear, but the first bit about schools working together, because one of my concerns has always been that a school that's doing really well, their head will be out about, they might be a challenge advisor, they might be involved with lots of things. So they're seeing loads of best practice, but for the schools that weren't doing so well, they were sort of stuck with, the school that's coming in. So it's really great to hear that that's broadening out. I got Rose next.
And it's lovely to hear the plans. I just want to take us back to the basics. A number of our secondary schools are in a licence deficit situation, and our IT equipment is absolutely deplorable. With the new curriculum going online, with everything going online, what are we in discussions about actually looking at the IT equipment that our schools are using?
Responsible for supporting the area of IT and the pedagogy and the training, as opposed to the infrastructure and procurement. With the digital competency framework, we align all our training and support to that to make sure that schools are advised on the best equipment, to have the right equipment to match pupil needs and the efficiencies of it, but we don't advise on specific approaches of how to buy it.
I understand that, and I understand we're discussing the plan, but if we don't have the equipment to implement this plan and the new curriculum within our secondary schools, where do we go from there?
Chair, I'll obviously need to come back on that, and obviously this is an issue for Council in general in any case, because Council sets the overall budget settlement. I question your analysis of what evidence base you've got to say is deplorable across our schools, because I think it's a mixed picture, and schools are responsible for clearly the procurement of their own IT infrastructure within the budget allocation that they get. And it is the case that some schools are in a much better position because of the choices the governing bodies and the head teachers have made over a period of time, and they prioritise differently. Now, notwithstanding that, we set up an ICT infrastructure group with head teachers, I think it was 2 years ago now, to look at maybe 3, to look at these issues and any issues that schools had, because network connectivity was a particular issue, making sure that all schools had access to the internet at a speed that allowed all learners to access at the same time, and we've largely addressed and resolved those issues now. One of the elements they're looking at in terms of the work programmes about that renewal process, and how do we make sure that schools and youngsters children have to get they need in front of them. We've had some grant recently, so we'll be helping schools procure a few hundred additional machines, which is welcome. But that's part of the remit for that group, which heads are driving, supported by local authority officers, and they are addressing that. So that, there are a number of different options they're looking at, including all paying in, almost on the savings schemes to procure equipment and prioritise the procurement of that equipment, to offer best advice to schools and governing bodies about how they might want to procure. But we don't have a magic wand. You're quite right to say that lots of our schools, secondary schools, are in financial difficulty in the extent of that they are facing choices that they need to make about how they want to spend their resources going forward. So it is the case, for example, in Torvine, we've got a more generous TLR settlement across our estate than maybe neighbouring authorities because of choices, again, that have been made in the past. That's got consequences then for the amount of resources left for other things. So we're working with heads to look at how they can set their medium-term financial plans to take account of the staffing issues, but also then the infrastructure and the maintenance issues that they face. I will always say, Chair, that if this committee was to make a recommendation to Council that we increase funding for secondary schools or schools in general, that's within your gift. But we are working to help schools make sure that they've got a financially secure position and have the right equipment in place. We have made some good progress, and it might be something that we ask the ICT group to maybe do a little bit of feedback on their work programme and bring that in. But there will always be an issue, and we all know this, that schools could always do with a lot more funding, give them more choices. But at the moment, I think we are managing that effectively, and no learner is disadvantaged by not having access to the equipment they need, because I don't think we're in that position. But schools are variable in how they've chosen to answer those challenges, but we're trying to support them with that.
A comment really. It is our most vulnerable people that are actually losing out by not having these the equipment at home. Most of our well-to-do parents supply their children with the necessary tools for schools, but it is our most vulnerable peoples that actually are losing out.
I got Cassie first and then John.
Just while we were discussing in amongst the new curriculum, how does the business plan take into account the proposed new curriculum, and is it going to be flexible enough to work within that, or is it going to need to be rewritten?
The curriculum plans are due to be reported very soon. Obviously, we've had the situation now where the pioneer schools have been developing the curriculum over a period of time across Wales, and they are about to report. There are a series of events which are now in the diary for the coming couple of months. For head teachers, local authority members will be attending, regional people, to actually report now on the content of what the curriculum is going to look like. So basically, the consultation for the white paper, I think, is just came out last week on it. So the consultation is live. So if you do want to make have a look and make a comment, feel free. But basically, I suppose we get into the business end now. There's been a lot of planning, and some areas have been better at sharing that information than others. And as Dermot alluded to earlier on, I think our pioneer schools have been quite effective in passing that information on to the other schools and keeping them up to speed. So it is going to mean change, obviously. It's one of the most radical changes to every part of education in Wales, whether it be from the inspectorate right the way down through to the teaching assistant in the classroom. What is different, I think, about this change to changes in the past, though, is that it is phased, it is over an extended period of time, and there is now, for instance, schools had to submit grant plans by last Friday. So every school had to submit a professional learning plan on how they're going to use the sum of money that they've been given to upskill their staff and to familiarise themselves with the new curriculum. Because I think, first thing is, schools have to come to terms with what the new curriculum actually means for them. So you've got professional learning leads in every school now as well, which have been funded. So every school has a professional learning lead. So whereas before, you might go into the assistant head and ask, "Oh, there's a lovely course next week I've seen in the Times Head. Can I go on it?" Now everything is really planned around the developments and upskilling to meet the national mission.
Could I just add a couple of things? In terms of the business plan, You'll see by the way it is written there is some flexibility there in order to adapt to change. It is not a plan that has timescales within it. There are other plans that sit underneath and support it that do that. With school-to-school working and particularly the Learning Network schools, there is a degree of flexibility as well in the way in which those schools can work in response to perhaps aspects that other schools are needing more support with within year, as opposed to it all having to be planned and stuck to a cycle.
Chair, I think, and hopefully this offers some reassurance to the committee. If you look at page, can't read that, 49 in the bundle, page 12 in the document, sorry, page 40, it looks at the success criteria. How will we know that we're actually being successful? And I think for me that gives us the writing frame, or gives us the agenda for the next discussion in March 2020 about, well, you know, that's the evidence we expect to see that our schools are engaging. You know, we've got just a really nice criteria, but we're just making clear our expectations for schools, for governors, for heads. That's what we expect you to be engaging in. That's how we'll know that we're actually getting some traction and moving forward on the outcome of those bullet points there. Will give us quite a rich picture, I think, of our readiness for the introduction of the new curriculum, and where we've got gaps or where we've got sticking points. Critical for me in this is I want to know schools who aren't signing up to come on the training. If, you know, we've got there's no point having a great professional learning offer that's got, you know, sparkles on it and it just looks fab. But if nobody turns up, or if they do turn up and it's not actually leading to change in the classroom. So I think what's good about the business plan this time around, it gives a very clear statement of this is what we should all be looking at. And you as governors, if you're on a governing body, should be saying to your head, hang on then, that's a useful little list here. That's your checklist to go through and say, well, have we done that? Where are we with that? So I think in subsequent reports that we bring back, we'll come back to that part of the business plan and say, here's where we are.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to focus on the key indicator of level 2+, which is obviously very important for young people when they leave school, and whether they have the access then in terms of their success or lack of it. For the fourth year in a row, this is reduced, and it's now 7.8 points below its 2015 level. You'd have to see my word for it, look at the data. Which is about 14% reduction. And with the only authority where there's been a continued reduction over those 4 years. Over the 3 years, Caerphilly is the same, but over 4 years, our level 2+ scores have reduced consistently. So, while we talked about improving picture, but I believe during you talked about less noticeable improvements in secondary performance, I suppose I have to ask for the third year in a row, what factors do you think have contributed to that continued decline, and what are you going to do to alleviate that?
We've obviously talked at members' sessions, members' briefings that I've done on the changing picture on the last couple of years of qualifications changes in Wales. I believe I've recognised a number of faces throughout those. There has been a changing picture in Wales where qualifications have become more rigorous over those time. There has been a change to English language, Welsh language, maths, science qualifications over that time. There's a further range last year of foundation phases of subjects where the qualifications were changed. There were also affecting the L2+, changes to science, so they no longer became eligible. That partly reflects some of that decline, as you put it, in terms of Torfaen schools. We know during that time that there's been variability. Some schools within Torfaen, those who have moved to change categories, have had significant improvement. But there are other schools where the performance is not good enough, and we have challenged leadership schools in those schools, and will continue to do that, to challenge the middle leadership. We'll support the middle leadership with our professional advice in terms of the English Maths Science advisors, the core that we have, to support in the classroom, support middle leaders mainly, but also support at the higher leadership level, so that the right decisions are taken perhaps in a more timely way to secure further improvement. Where we recognise in some of our schools, you're right, it is that L2 plus performance is not good enough at the moment. We also have a change in context coming up, which Julian alluded to earlier, where the measures that are going to be important in terms of Welsh Government are going to be a changing picture, where you're going to have to get all of your provision right, not just a certain core subjects, and that provision is going to have to be right for every learner, irrespective, as Julian mentioned, whether they're moving from a D to a C. It's equally important, perhaps, the learner moves from a G to an E. Yeah. We're tackling in this business plan both at the same time, in a way, in that we are trying to support the wider curriculum reform, curriculum change, all subjects, all leadership issues. But yes, in those core subjects which impact on the L2, there is work to do in those core subjects as well. That's fully acknowledged.
And I think at the end of the day as well, we can advise and support, but it is up to the schools to engage fully and implement fully. I take my role, for instance, if I was a challenge advisor in a red school, I'd be in the school for 25 days. That doesn't mean I lead the school for 25 days, because who leads it for the other 170? So I think, and we know our schools well in the region, but I would also say that you know your schools very well in Torfaen, very well indeed. And I think that the specific actions that have been taken will address those issues. So it's not just about the level 2 plus. For me, it's far more fundamental. It's about the link between teaching and learning and standards. Because you can't drive up standards without ensuring quality teaching and learning. And I think that is where the disconnect is, and that is where the focus of the work is and will continue to be. And the level 2 plus is a measure which could be gained in the past, and we all know the reason the accountability model is changing is to negate against those. So to answer your question, as I said, I go back, we can advise, we can support schools in as many different ways as possible, but it is for the school to take on board and ensure that the quality of the teaching and learning is to the required standard, and then working together, and we've already alluded that one of the things going forward is to be able to inform local authorities with sufficient confidence of where interventions are needed. But in Torfaen, it is an authority which has always responded promptly to deal with such issues. So I have a confidence moving forward that the things that are in train now and the things that will continue to be in train will continue to benefit all learners in all schools, irrespective of where they are at the moment.
Yeah, I accept your point, but it's not a key indicator for nothing, is it? And it is a measure which leaves us 18th out of 22nd, and it's been like that for 4 years. So you talk about you're putting things in place. Well, 4 years has gone down the line. 4 years of children have left school, and one can argue we've underachieved compared to other authorities. And that's the point. I mean, you talked about, Mr. Price talked about changing qualifications. Well, of course, all kids did the same qualifications. So, and we compare less favourably to other authorities within the consortium. And I haven't looked at across the picture of Wales as a whole. So, I mean, my concerns remain that I keep asking this question year on year, and you keep coming back and telling me that things are changing, but I don't see any change.
If I could just make one point on the 18th, which you quoted in terms of rank position. Obviously, rank positions are complex because you have to factor in a certain level of socio-economic disadvantage, as Estyn would. You would not expect Torfaen, although it is certainly an aspiration, to exceed performance of Monmouthshire on socio-economic performance, or perhaps the Vale of Glamorgan, although we aim to be further up that league table than we currently are as a local authority, as all local authorities are seeking to achieve as well.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, John, you've got a point. No one's accepting the Key Stage 4 performance is anywhere near where it needs to be. As Julian alluded to earlier, there's been a change in leadership in every secondary school in the last 5 years. Okay, we've actually changed all of the heads. They've changed. We've seen significant improvement in some areas but not necessarily on all indicators, and that isn't good enough. It just isn't acceptable. I think we've got a clear evidence base that where we've got the data and the support, from the colleagues in the EAS, we've intervened with schools, and where we have intervened, we are seeing good take-up and sort of closing the gap in many of those schools. It's been a very difficult journey in Key Stage 4 in particular, and we clearly have got more work to do in some schools. But we can see traction, there is evidence there, but the pace of that change isn't good enough. We've been very clear with those schools, with the governing bodies and head teachers, where that isn't the case. What will happen if we don't see an acceleration in that pace of improvement? And we don't accept, wait for the next set of results, you'll see the outcome. So we're with those schools on a monthly basis, saying, well, show us the evidence now. It isn't okay to wait to the end. And we've made it very clear what we think should happen and what actions we will take. If those schools cannot evidence the impact they are making in the here and now, and we will not be dissuaded from that course, we've got more work to do, because it's not okay, and I take your point, it isn't okay. But Julian's comment about, at the end of the day, the EAS are in there 25 days a year for a red category school. The local authority, that is our school improvement agency. We don't replicate what the EAS does, we support their work. We have to put that focus back with school. If there's something else we need to do to support you, we'll be absolute, and be that equipment, be that about additional support, we will do what we can in all instances to offer that support. But ultimately, it's the head teacher, the senior leadership team, the staff in schools, who also are the ones who are there day in, day out. Our job is to make sure we take away any barrier to them being successful. But ultimately, and it was back to a question I was asked in council before, that responsibility primarily sits with that leadership team in school. Our job is to make sure that we hold them to account, but also offer every support we can. And I'm confident we can evidence that's the case. We've got more work to do, and we will be continuing in that vein. The other thing I should say, and it might come back to when we offer a refresh on the self-evaluation, because I'm conscious that we've said we'll bring that back when we've refreshed it, and we're coming to the end of that process, is that some of our demographics have changed too. Now, I'm saying this not as an explanation or an excuse, but I think, in the past we've talked about being on the average 10 to 3 school meals, and that's not where we are anymore. It's been a long time since we've been in that position. So we probably do need to refresh the context and still say our aspirations are as high as ever, and we don't want to be mediocre. We're not here just to be okay. We want the best for our learners. But yeah, absolutely, lots to be done in a changing landscape. But the focus has to come back to the individual outcomes for our individual learner. So whatever the outcome measures we get at the end, I want to be able to have confidence that you can be confident that we've done the best we can for each individual learner, whatever that outcome measure is. And that's the dialogue we have with schools every time. We're not interested in gaming, we're not interested in those headline figures alone. We're interested in every child's journey.
Thanks. You pre-answered one of my questions, so that was good on the pace of progress. One of the things I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned 25 days for schools in the red category, so how many days is it for schools in amber? Up to 50. So obviously we know there's improvement, albeit slow, and the pace is slow and the improvement is not what we'd want. One of the things I'm concerned about. So we've got one school that's gone into green secondary now, into a green category, so I presume that their support will be significantly less than they've had in the past. How do we ensure that they don't drop back down?
One of the things that basically we started across the region, and it started with primaries, was peer working in its infancy. Peer working, when it was in its infancy, we had groups of strong primary schools who started to work together to share the excellent practice, if you like, because it started as a green school to green school thing. Then we've gradually rolled that out across the piece. One of the things we've noticed then is, sometimes you can have a change in leadership or a key member of staff leaves, and perhaps that school just requires a little bit more support. Doesn't mean it's no longer a good school, it might need additional support. If the debtor's got a headship elsewhere, we've had a classic example of that in one of our secondary schools recently. So school will need support. So it's about responding to that. And I think with the way we're taking the peer working forward, it allows for that. The way we are using the LNS schools allows for that. And what we are saying now as well, there is going to be a greater accountability for one of the use of a clumsy word, even in green schools moving forward. So that it's basically making sure that if circumstances change, whether it be a demographic one or whatever, or key members of staff leave, that we know about it and we can respond appropriately and up the level of support or whatever. It is possible to up the level of support at any time. For instance, a school could be yellow now, and if it went into an Estin review category, we would automatically up the level of support. At whatever point it is. So it's not just a one-off thing that happens with categorisation. You know, categorisation, if you like, in some ways is the elephant in the room. It's the process of categorising schools for support, but we all know that, you know, we're dealing with humans and it can change at any point during the year, and we have the flexibility to be able to up the support. And although we are talking about allocation of challenge advisor days there for school, don't forget as well that we have support around foundation phase, key stage 2, literacy, numeracy, well-being and equity, maths, English. So for instance, some of our secondary schools, they might be having 25 days of a challenge advisor, but their maths EAS person is in there one day every fortnight. Their English advisor is in there one day every fortnight. Their science advisor is in there. So if in a support category, so if they're in a high support category and they really need that level of support,
I suppose my concern is if we've got schools that are coming up to the top of that amber and approaching that yellow, and as things are withdrawn slowly, that there's the danger that they'll fall back down, and I suppose that's my concern, but you've in part answered that, so thanks.
Just to add to that, one of the things that we do regularly with colleagues in the EAS is sit down and look at the whole picture for the school. So categorisation captures significant information about the school, but as Councillor Seaborn said earlier, if the school's in financial difficulty, that brings a range of pressures with it. If the school's got issues around HR, if it's got issues around support for additional learning needs, if the SENC, either the Elenco goes off or whatever. So we share that information about schools. We don't just look at a narrow lens, we look at the widest possible lens. And there have been instances where we've had to intervene to help schools in terms of exclusions or attendance issues. That's a whole school issue, and that ripples back through our discussions. So we're always looking to see what the right collection of support the school needs, and not just taking that one lens. And you know, we're really conscious that when you get to green, isn't it great, and people love a good, you know, celebration, and that's wonderful. But equally, we're conscious that that doesn't mean everything's okay, or everything's as good as it needs. You got to stay there. Then, well, what are the challenges that means? And so we are always sensitised to making sure that we've got the right support across our whole range of interventions and support we can put in place.
In addition, you know, they're actually formalised. We have the wider group meetings on a monthly basis. I meet Sharon. We have an LAQA meeting on a monthly basis and on a term, and we've just introduced now. It's almost the LA on. It's not on a page. It's on about 14 pages, but it's all on A3 paper, and it covers everything from every school that's receiving every scrap of support, uptake of courses. So it's a really good way of a local authority seeing what its schools are engaging in and where they are as well, and that is literally new for this month almost. So that's another way of moving forward, of trying to keep that level of information up, because for whatever reason, yeah, we can all, you know, get to a certain point and fall backwards, and it's about making sure that we respond with immediacy and not leave it and find out in July.
Just to clarify on you for this year and this month, it has been provided over a number of years. Yeah. It's just collated into a much more digestible form. Yeah. It's the big change.
And can I just add on, when you mentioned about, obviously, if the school goes yellow, they were amber. We have had examples in the past where a school, quite rightly, has been categorised yellow. They've come up from amber, but we've still kept the EIB meetings going just to ensure the monitoring and evaluating and to ensure that the support is appropriate for them, and schools have welcomed that. They've worked it. It's not something we have forced on them. We've had the conversation with them to say, shall we continue these, just to ensure that the level of support is adequate, and especially where we've seen as well possibly a change in leadership in the school for whatever reason, and the schools have found that valuable then, because we're there, we can interject as and when we need to then.
Can I just... You said then about where schools engage, you can show the LEA where schools engage. There's quite a lot of wheres through the report. Does that indicate that sometimes schools don't engage? You know, is that an issue in Torfaen?
Again, dealing with humans, sometimes, you know, for various circumstances. If it involves a member of staff coming out and you've got another staff absence that day, you know, it's quite possible they might not come out for something. What I will say is if you look at the attendance rates in secondary sector, for instance, at the heads of department meeting for maths, English, quite often the rollout of the ETLF programme and everything, we provide statistics on uptake and percentages for local authorities, and I would say quite often Torfaen has the highest attendance rates at most of the things that are provided to support schools.
But when we say don't engage, we don't mean a school that doesn't engage in absolutely anything. It's looking in the round.
Yeah.
You know, there are certain things that are not right for certain schools. They don't need that. But there are many, many core things where they do, and that's what we need to look at, isn't it?
But clearly, we get that information. We're always interested to see it.
Yeah.
And we have a friendly discussion with the school about that's interesting. But this is a real priority, and you know, schools, it tends to be because schools are under a lot of pressure, and we understand that too. And there'll be reasons why that's the case. But schools always attend the things they need to attend, and we're really keen to know about that because we're putting the investment in. Council's spending that resource. Welsh Government are also funding 50 million into the region on different interventions as well. And we only get one chance to do it, so we want to make sure we get the best out of it. So that's an important part of us, our role too.
I'm interested in the peer-to-peer work in schools, and can you just explain how we match the schools up? And can you give some examples, please?
When we ran the first pilot this year, which included categorisation, I'll use the one peer cluster, which was Abersychan, Croesy-Ceiliog, which is appropriate because obviously two are in Torfaen, and they were matched with Rheoldi. Now they were matched because they were all in similar categories, similar Estyn categories, and so on. So we've matched the three together because we basically thought that they were at various stages on the journey within those categories and so on, and they could help. I think it's a shame that I didn't have David Taylor and Phil Collins sitting beside me, the two heads, because within 3 days of the first visit to Rheoldi School, Dave Taylor was on the phone to me, nagging me about it's a tracking system called SMID. Within 3 weeks of it, SMID was set up in Croesy-Ceiliog School, and Sharon and Dermot attend the monthly IB meetings with me. If you see how they are now tracking pupils' progress, not just whole school, but departments, individual pupils, vulnerable groups. So this is the idea. It's working together. So that's one example. I've alluded to we've got other examples now set up where we've got a school, maybe a secondary school, which is not performing where we would like it to, for a range of reasons, but some very high-performing primary schools in its cluster which feed the school. So it's about what can we do working together. I mean, we spoke about transition earlier on, didn't we? And like this transition in terms of teaching and learning. So what can the primary schools do for the secondary do for that? So we've got clusters running in that. We've got high-performing schools in the region, and St Albans is actually involved in one of these, where basically they've gone green, but we think there's a little bit more to come. So it's not about turning green, pipe and slippers time, sit back. It's about driving them on to the next level. So we've actually set up clusters with a school out of region. So we've got some high-performing green secondary schools from the region, one of which is St Albans, but actually working with Bishop O'Landa in Cardiff as a peer group, which is a very high-performing school, and Stanwell in the Vale of Glamorgan, which is another very high-performing school. So we've been very, very careful in looking at the individual needs of these schools and what they need to develop, but also what they have to offer. Because I think quite often we see green schools, as I said, it's all about support, but green schools, they're the great schools, they've got all the answers. They haven't. Sometimes a yellow school or an amber school, there are good teachers in all schools, red schools, amber schools, yellow schools. There's good teachers, good leaders, just not enough of them perhaps. We're consistently doing. So it's about looking at what the school has to offer, what the school needs to gain, and very carefully putting them together.
Just to add one example from a primary perspective, Our Lady of the Angels worked with 3 other primary schools in different local authorities. They were one of the voluntary green to green groups that was set up. They'd worked together for 3 or 4 years almost, worked very effectively. Middle leaders have all been to each other's schools to look at practice and learn from each other. Those were one of the groups this time that we carried on because we knew it was working effectively. Other groups we encouraged and moved around to better fits perhaps to help their development. So it's organic in a way. It's not done on a whim. There's quite a lot of discussion between the 5 PCAs, challenge advisors as to the best fit for the schools involved.
And I think the other thing which I will say to you and which can be brought back to this committee at some point in future, because it's a pilot this year, we wanted to make sure that what we were doing actually works. So we've engaged Professor Mick Waters, who is leading on this for us. So it's not just, we thought it was a good idea, let's, when we got a bit of cash, let's throw some money and hope it works. All the planning for this was done in conjunction with Mick Waters, and that's why we've got 5 different group types, if you like, running. And at the end of the year, this project is going to be evaluated by Professor Waters and a report published on the impact of it and the success of it, and then from that, well, obviously, I'm fairly confident that if I'm sitting here this time next year, that you will see an influence from that report somewhere in here around the further development of the next stage of the peer working. Because we've stopped calling it peer review, because review, schools get twitchy because they just think it's another form of scrutiny or another form of accountability. So it's peer working. It's learning the good things from other schools. So that's what, does that answer your question?
Involving other authorities as well, are we going right outside the region, are we?
Looking across all 5 authorities within the region. As I said, Croeso-Keillog and Aberystwyth, we're working with Hywel and Caerphilly. But we're also now this year involving cross-regional working, so we've got Stanwell and Bishop Alanda from Central South, from Cardiff and Vale Glamorgan.
Before I bring those in, just a sec, because you mentioned the SMUD. I'm Governor at Crossy, and that was actually one of my questions, because it is an amazing system. When we're talking about how we're tracking pupils, for example, obviously we can't tell schools what system to have, but what kind of thing, is there any sort of consistency going on across schools, and also from primary up, because I hear still from secondaries a lot of complaints about teacher assessment coming into secondary, where obviously if you've got a tracking system, they're looking at their results. Do you know what I mean? Is that available to secondary teachers?
With tracking systems, it's ease of use, and for me it's how the information is used by school leaders. That is key. The technology behind it isn't really at all what matters, is it? It's how it's used to inform in a timely manner and intervene appropriately. That's the one thing I would say. SMID seems to be one that is easy to use, easy to access, therefore it allows more time for intervention and doing and getting on with the job. As far as teacher assessment with accountability frameworks is going to assume much less importance as the new curriculum comes in for accountability. We're going to have to support schools in providing a smarter range of more qualitative information on learners beyond test. Although national test to be used in a formative way and a supportive way, that will help, but it's looking at learners in the round and their needs as opposed to just the number from an end of key stage assessment, which I think is critical as they move to secondary school.
But I just finish on SMID. I think SMID is a typical example of schools working with other schools, seeing something and actually seeing it being used. Because, if I was a SMID rep, I love it a bit, but I could be unscrupulously going around the region saying, oops, SMID, £3,000, thank you very much. But when schools go into another school and see it being used, and I think the attractiveness of SMID is that the fact that all the middle leaders are using it. So it's just not me as the data manager in the school giving somebody a piece of paper and saying, these are your pupils, go away and work well. This is what middle leaders are actually doing on a class base, on a pupil base, on a group base, and making the decisions and stuff and knocking their heads down and saying, I'm actually going to change this because of... And I think that's where it becomes important. And I think that's Ed's point of it's what you do with it, not the system. So whether it's SMID or anything else, it's what you do with it.
This also links back to some of the questions that you've asked and the answers we've given around peer support and cluster working as well. The clusters are in different positions, so some of our secondary schools work hand in glove with their primary colleagues and have done that challenge face to face. So the example I think we have from Abersakin, wasn't it, in the cluster there, where they'd actually done the moderation of teacher assessment together, but they'd done it with a bit of gusto, and really it was very, very challenging. And that's not universally the case. So there's a little question back to you, or a challenge back to you as Governor, is to take that question back into the governing body and say, well, why aren't we working with our feeder primary schools in the way that other clusters are? Because we're sharing that best practice, and obviously we're challenging schools as well. But I'll take that back as well. We know that other clusters in Torvine are actually doing something about this. So rather than sitting in one school saying, oh, over there, well, go and meet them, go and talk to them. How do we actually support each other to get the best outcome?
Should add, that is still a statutory process. I know I said things are changing, but it's still a statutory process for this summer, and as far we do know of no intention for it to go as a statutory process yet, but it's not to be used for accountability purposes, is what I was referring to it.
Thanks, Chair. Interestingly, you mentioned two of the schools in Torvine being green, and the two schools were faith schools. So I just wondered whether or not they're doing something different, being funded differently, or rather you mentioned Our Ladies of Angels and St Albans being the schools, and it just hit me that they were both faith schools. So have we looked at what they're doing differently?
In fact, I think that the funding with St Albans is... Well, we've had, I remember being in there 2 years ago and having conversations around budgets and allocations and, not pleading poverty, but I think it just comes back to quality of teaching and learning, which is being implemented and managed and evaluated from the top. It's the systems. You look at St Albans' outcomes for many, many years. They've been quite high. They've had good systems. They've had good teaching and good processes. But I certainly wouldn't like to pass a comment around finances and whether, denominational schools, because I would say no, from my knowledge.
Yeah. I didn't think we've any direct evidence that faith-based schools, because we've also got faith-based schools that we've had to intervene indirectly, or not be at Roman Catholic schools, but, so I think that in itself isn't...
Just jumped out at me that there were two faith schools and they were too high green.
But equally, we've also had to intervene in faith schools which have been Roman Catholic in the recent past, and look at executive headships and support the school quite closely. And we've also had some Church and Wales schools where, up until very recently, we've been very heavily involved and still are actually.
And Arbeit schools, primary.
And across the region, there'd be no correlation.
Yeah. Just wondered whether they were being funded better. I'm sorry.
Yeah, listen to all this, how are teachers assessed in the schools? Assessed? You say you're not going to assess teachers on this new format? How are they assessed now at the moment?
No, so when I talk about accountability, it's about the data at the end of key stage. Performance management, there is a statutory process for performance management in place in every school. It's a statutory entitlement because of the support that can be provided as part of performance management, but it is a way of coming to a judgment on the objectives that are set for an individual teacher, which should be aligned. Yes, there will be individual aspects, but it should be aligned to the school development priorities and the needs of the learner. And every year, every teacher is assessed against the progress they make against those objectives. And there are no changes to that forthcoming that we're aware of. There was one big change this year where for the first time there are the new professional standards out, and teachers are now assessed against those new professional standards rather than the old ones, which have been around probably about 8 years before. The new professional standards are much more aligned to the needs of the new curriculum and professional learning. So they'll continue to be assessed.
Kelly? Yeah. So one of the things is mentioned regularly throughout this, and every time we look at anything to do with schools in Torfaen, is the socio-economics. And I just wondered what specific plans have we, or the ES, have we got in place to reduce the difference in outcomes of pupils between gender, FSM? Is the PDG grant being used, wisely? How are we tackling that?
I think that, yes, Torfaen specifically, because that's the meeting day, but obviously it's across Wales. You can see it from the plan. It's in there. What we've got in place now, we've got a wellbeing and equity lead we've appointed, who's an ex-primary head teacher, very experienced in that area. As I said, we've got wellbeing leads in schools. We've got a real focus, as I mentioned earlier on, next year going forward, for instance, the focus on FSM through every strand. So there's a big focus, and there's a golden thread now running through everything in the quality of teaching. So it's not just about results, and then, we've got to get over a threshold for FSM pupils as well. It's about looking at teaching and learning and pedagogy from the point of view of all pupils and what the vulnerable pupils need, maybe as a bespoke support intervention as well. So, and across the region as well, we've implemented now, through the professional advice which we've shared with all local authorities, is a wellbeing review. So we're rolling out wellbeing reviews with local authority staff members, where they're going into schools and doing a wellbeing review around the processes to support the vulnerable groups within school as well. So it's a bit like a leadership review or a key stage 3 review that you might get in the secondary school. So we're actually rolling that out now as part of the remit of the new appointment that we've made, to make sure that schools are actually not just planning, because we can all have a plan on the shelf, can't we? It's about having the impact of that plan and how they're going to measure that impact, and obviously whether it is working or not. And that's the principles underlying behind the wellbeing reviews.
So one pilot, this has only been agreed in the last month, so it's not a named project in this plan, but RADI, Reducing Attainment for Disadvantaged Youngsters, is something we're looking to pilot. It's been in existence for England, in parts of England for a number of years, where you'll see in the business plan, FSM is the #1 priority for Torfaen schools. This programme seeks, ultimately, when disadvantaged learners leave primary school, we know that their outcomes are lower than their non-FSM peers. What that will then dictate the way target systems work now is the learner who's a level 5 will then have a higher target set than perhaps some of the free school meal learners. What it seeks to do at year 7 when learners arrive in is, right, let's equalise that gap. To say, right, if you're a free school meals learner, we will imagine that perhaps you haven't had the support around you at home to be able to have got that level 5, but we will set you a target that's higher. Perhaps more resources go in to that learner to reflect that higher target. We will see how that develops over time, but it's trying to remove those artificial ceilings perhaps for some of those learners.
I think, Chair, just because that point I raised earlier, we've come together with the 5 directors, together with the Principal Challenge Advisors, and we know we've more to do. No one's really cracked this across the UK. And while we've got good monitoring systems in place for use of PDG in terms of how funding is used, we're not seeing the shift that we all want to see. So we're keen to look at breaking down maybe some of the barriers between what school improvement and actually who's got knowledge of a school, who could actually make an intervention or support, who sits in the local authority. How do we join up the local authority a little bit more with colleagues from the ES and get a richer understanding and support to schools? So we haven't done the piece of work yet, but we want to make sure we're not leaving anything unlooked at, and we wanted to see how we can actually come together on a regional basis to see if there's any other incremental improvement we can get, and make sure that school development plans are really targeting this in an effective way. Because if we it's that old truism, if you get it right for vulnerable learners, you get it right for everybody.
That's true.
So we want to just go back and look at that again. So we have another chunk of work allocated to go and do that coming up in the next few weeks.
Thank you, Chair. My question relates to the strategic priorities and the associated improvement strands. I'm just wondering, do you review the previous strands? Because I can't see any evidence of a review process in the bundle I've got. I don't know whether there's anything or not, I've missed something or not. And how is that process done?
Hi, sorry, John, it's the last bit.
I just wondering, how is that process of reviewing done without being accused of marking your own homework?
Well, I think we're probably the one you could accuse the least of marking your homework. I'll just run through the process, John, for you. There is a self-evaluation, a very thorough self-evaluation, which is done and is currently in the process of being done, but it's not quite complete. It's updated. And will be available for you to see it at any point once it's completed. But I think if you look at the process, the initial planning meeting starts with SUC at a very high level and high level priorities. It then goes through head teacher strategy groups, governing body strategy groups, through JEG, where your cabinet member and your director actually has an input. It goes through scrutiny and will come through scrutiny through this department, and then it ultimately goes back to the company board. So I think you can begin to see, and I mustn't forget the pupil voice, which is incorporated in this as well. So we are far from marking our own homework, and there is a detailed self-evaluation. The self-evaluation is actually reflected in the plan itself, because as we all know, you can't write a plan without effective, or you can't write a good plan without effective self-evaluation. And if your effective self-evaluation is not reflected in your plan, one or t'other is not done effectively. So our plan is actually the outcome of the self-evaluation. So that everything that's contained in the self-evaluation that needs progressing, you see in front of you in that plan. It's just you haven't got the report with you, but we can provide that at a future date to satisfy your needs. That we're not marking our own homework.
And obviously, Chair, then that self-evaluation resonates in our self-evaluation and the plans that we have and the feedback that we give through a couple of performance assessment sessions as well, and all the performance management process that we have both within Council and where applicable into the PSB as well. Have to get the golden thread in there. So.
Yeah. In fact, I'm currently working with Dermot and Sharon on the LA's self-evaluation report together as well.
So it takes me swiftly into question 15, is the 4.7 of the report risks. How do you feel the potential risk barriers listed in 4.7 can be overcome? And as a committee, is there anything you could suggest that we should be recommending to help alleviate these risks?
First one, consultation events. Julian's just run through the range of consultation events. I would say that for this, Tour Scrutiny have always provided us written feedback, and we welcome that, and it has been incorporated and informed previous plans, so we welcome written feedback should you provide it, but we'll take on board what's been said today. The work in improving outcomes, particularly vulnerable learners, that risk is because we are working through schools ultimately and school leaders. It is the duty of the LA to promote high standards, promote effective learning in our schools. It's the promotion of it needs us working with a range of partners. That's the risk there. We work to maximise relationships first of all, but where necessary intervene appropriately to support.
Yeah,
do you want to add to that?
I mean, in a sense, you think about our risk register and the EAS risk register, which this isn't. These are generic risks. We'd normally colour code these, wouldn't we, and say, well, is it a high level or medium level?
Yes.
This is always a risk, but it's quite a low level one given the performance that we've had. Yeah. But there's always a risk that people won't fully participate, so it's not reflected. But I think that's a low risk.
You're right, they are generic. The next one, the LA, lack of clarity about LA roles, that's generic. That's not something we are concerned about. And Julian is the PCA with the relationship between the AS and Torvine.
I think coming back to those risks, don't forget this is the regional business plan and the risks. And it's a bit like earlier on we were talking about the uptake of Torvine schools and staff to the professional learning offer, and they've been very, very positive. I will say as the PCA that we have a very, very open, clear and clarity around the roles of where we support each other as a local authority in AS. That is not an issue for Torvine. Might not be an issue. It might not be less of an issue in other areas, but in Torvine that is not an issue. Likewise, school settings that require improvement and not identified at an early enough stage, well, that's not Torvine. We have, as I said, the regular meetings I alluded to earlier on, but there is always an immediate response, and if something cropped up and we didn't have a meeting planned, we'd be, you can rest assured, we'd be on the phone to each other one way or t'other. Agreed actions are always carried out in a timely manner. If we agree that something needs addressing, then it is acted upon, and there is a consistent application of the regional protocols in Torvine. So you can begin to see it. Although it's in there, it's a bit of a pointless list really to be discussed at this particular meeting because a lot of them don't apply to Torvine. Any statutory powers are not utilised in a consistent, well, they are in Torvine, and the last one, I'm afraid, yes, that's for everybody.
Yeah, the financial projections is an interesting one. You'll see, if you went into the main plan, approximately 50% of our budget is from LA, approximately 50% of our budget is from grant funding on a one-year basis from Welsh Government, usually on a one-year basis. We can predict, but we can only predict, not guarantee that stream of income.
So I think hopefully we've clarified the risk that, I think as Dermot said, in some ways, perhaps it might have been easier to RAG rate them for the various authorities, but obviously in the business plan, it is the regional business plan, and it doesn't have that.
So, as a supplementary, do you have a list of risks for Torvine?
We have our own more comprehensive generic risks register, which is RAG rated. I imagine you would have in place a...
Just to clarify the supplementary question, I think what you're asking is, are there specific risks bespoke to Torvine around the business plan? No. And I haven't heard any, so I'm hoping you're going to say no.
I am prepared. I'll go on record. Well, I am anyway. But no.
So as far as this committee is concerned,
as far as this,
on that list, yes.
It's as far as it is a factual. It's a fact that the working relationship between the region and Torvine is a very close, open, transparent working relationship. And if there were anything which arose either way from Torvine not being satisfied with any element of our work, the expectation is you need to tell me straight away. And likewise, but there are no skeletons lurking in the cupboard.
That we know about.
Are all local authorities reducing the amount of funding that they are providing to EAS this year? And if they are, how are you going to manage your resources in order to effectively continue the support?
I'll answer the first bit. So we get into discussion with EAS, ongoing discussion with EAS about the resources that local authorities provide. There has been an agreed savings measure that's been agreed across the piece, and we project that forward for 3 years. So as a group of directors and local authorities, we're keen to make sure that we've got a unified position so that we can, just Ed's point, we can give as much predictability for what is ultimately, what is our company, it is our service at the end of the day, because it's in our interest to make sure it's robust and it's doing the job we need it to. So we come to a collective position, but we do that in collaboration with colleagues in the EAS. Obviously that goes through the company board. The company board has written to leaders, I think, just before Christmas. I know we've responded, and I think at least one or two others have. But I think that there's a clear, unified position on that, because it has to be manageable. We know there are challenges ahead, because if the company had to lose staff, ultimately we'd be responsible for those too. So that's part of our collective responsibility to help ensure that the company is solvent and continues to go from strength to strength. So if we need to update the collaborative and members agreement, which I think we do need to tweak currently. The rules that govern how we work together around the funding, for example, and that's what we're doing. I think that's in process at the moment.
Just a small point to add that where there have been savings year on year from 2012 in terms of reduction of company size, but far more school-to-school working. The managing director, Debbie, over the last number of years, has always made the decision we could have, for example, looked at retaining the core but reducing the delegation we give to schools. We've never done that in any single year. The delegation rate to schools from the grants we have, nothing is top sliced. 94% and growing out to schools of the grants we control on behalf of the local authorities. So we do make the tougher decisions to slim down as appropriate rather than retaining money which is better placed in schools.
I suppose my question follows on in part then, really, because obviously this is a regional plan, but each LA will have its own strategic priorities. Many of them will overlap.
Yes.
So has the EAS got the resource capacity in people, in everything, to hit each of those strategic priorities right across, and with the focus each priority needs?
Simple answer is yes. No, there's no other way of putting it. It's not an if and but or maybe. You know, we have the capacity. As I said, we've increased around the areas of need, well-being, for instance, being a strength in the vulnerable people working in that aspect. All our secondary schools are covered by, very experienced secondary CAs. A lot of our primary CAs now are partner heads, so they're very experienced heads in current schools who have one or two schools, will be a CA in one school maybe or two at the most, and run their own school, so they've all got that relevant experience. And we have a list of people who want to come and work for us. So,
just to add, keep doing that. But linked to capacity, we have traditionally always struggled with Welsh medium capacity for challenge advisors. We have managed to fill that by utilising partner CAs from schools, but whenever we've gone out to recruitment, we have always struggled to recruit permanent. So there are, whilst we're saying on the finance side there are still some struggles with capacity that we continuously strive to mitigate and resolve.
And the important point also is that as the company and the business of the ES has evolved and changed over time, as the 5 local authorities, we try to make sure, while there are some differences, there's a lot of common ground. So we want to make sure that we don't have 5 separate school improvement services. The reason we set up the regional service in the first place was to maximise the benefit. So we've also tried to make sure that we coordinate our demands on the EAS so that we're not seeing replication of function or across the services. We try and coordinate things. So increasingly what the core offers is the majority of what we need. And if we need to have bespoke conversations, then we can have those too. But we're trying to maximise that benefit for being in a collaborative arrangement.
We've heard quite a lot this afternoon about vulnerable learners. I'd like to focus a little bit on MAP learners now. And I'd just like to know, how are we tracking and monitoring their progress? And are there any special provisions for MAT students for their transition from primary to secondary?
We've actually got a cluster now, which is part of the pilot, which is a more able and talented cluster. So we are going down that route with in terms of transfer from primary into secondary. So we've got that in hand. It's very much in its infancy. So again, it's watch this space, and we can be able to report back in future. But it's something that's very much on the radar and has been for a long while. In terms of tracking, it's what we can legally ask the schools to provide to us. Now, in terms of data, obviously at Key Stage 4 there was the A-star A measures and so on, which whether they persist or not obviously is up for debate. But certainly it is part of, if you like, the generic conversations that go on between all challenge advisors and secretary heads when they're in the school. So we actually class more able and talented as vulnerable learners. They're just groups of learners, different groups of learners. So the conversation may well be, what are you doing with your group of vulnerable learners, or in this group, in this group, in this group. It is also what you do with your more able and talented. And in addition to that then as well, you've you might have heard of the Seren project now, because that's been running for several years in secondary schools, and the idea of the Seren, that's now being rolled down as we speak into a pre-16 Seren project. I can't remember the actual title of it. I think it's once we call the executive, but they're now rolling that down into Key Stage 4. So whereas it was a project for sixth formers to aspire to, you know, the likes of Oxbridge and so on, it's now about moving that down into Key Stage 4. So there's a very strong focus on all learners, you know, as a prerequisite to the national mission and everything else that's formed, and we're in line with that.
Clarify, although we can't, what we're allowed to ask schools to give us and so on is evolving, we do, as Julian said, in every discussion we have with the schools, ask about those learners, because that's a really significant point. So the intervention meetings we have in nearly all of our secondary schools, that's a regular feature of, you know, and you know, they are vulnerable learners in the sense that unless the right provisions in place, they will not maximise the potential they have. So when Julian's talking about vulnerable, that's what we mean. We want to make sure every individual child gets the best possible outcome.
Back to your recruitment of Walsh, and I wondered whether or not there was any collaboration with the other regional services, such as West Wales. Obviously, South East Wales is a predominantly non-Welsh speaking area, and whether or not we were able to get some support from Welsh.
We've had contract challenge advisors for a number of years who live in West Wales but work with us in our schools. So yes, we do that in addition to our own very highly effective Welsh medium heads in primary schools who will use as challenge advisors to other LAs within the region.
And we've also had projects where we've used Welsh medium schools in Central South working alongside the likes of Cwmrymni and Caerphilly and so on developing resources and teaching materials as well. So we don't just stay within the region. Where we see best practice, we feel that it is right and proper to broker that practice into the region for our schools and for our children.
And it's worth also saying that the Welsh members of our advisory service, you know, have led on national projects and supported other regions. It's not that they do support out to the other regions, which may be more predominantly Welsh speaking.
If I remember some while ago, we had some comments about the lack of support really for science in schools. I just wondered whether you've taken on any extra sort of challenge advisors to support that now.
What we've done, we've obviously got our core science staff who are leading it, but now as part of the LNS schools development, we now have schools who are very, very strong in science, Basleg being a classic example. So, for instance, Croeso-Ceiliog is now paid its science support with Basleg. So Patrick, the head of the second in science from Basleg, goes in once a fortnight to Croeso-Ceiliog, and Steve, the head of science from Croeso-Ceiliog, has gone down to Basleg as well. So we've got that exchange of information and processes as well. So we have enhanced, because obviously science now, as part of the increased provision, and away from it just being English and maths. So what we've done is, where we haven't been able to secure individuals, we have now secured support through local network school or learning network schools, like Basleg, whose science results are excellent. So.
Good afternoon. I have a question about A-level provision. My question is, does the EAS have the relevant expertise in A-level provision, considering that the formula of A-level provision in the region is not ubiquitous, i.e. some authorities have retained traditional sixth forms, whilst I know Brynau Gwent has gone down the tertiary college model, and this authority is going down the tertiary college model.
The EAS doesn't have any statutory responsibility post-16.
Okay.
For
Sorry. We have, and the LAs have responsibility for post-16 provision in our schools, not in tertiary, in terms of providing with support. They will have their own support mechanisms. What Talvein's doing, I'm sure Dermot will add to this, is making sure and working with the providers to ensure that we do have data so that our learners we know when they leave our schools what they're actually achieving in terms of A-level.
But we have supported sixth forms with National Project for Prison. We alluded to the CERN project earlier on. Also around the ALPS data sets and for target setting post-16, because now there is a far greater emphasis on target setting in a similar way to Key Stage 4. So we've supported all secondary schools with the use of ALPS around data and tracking and targets. So we do support the sixth one, but not from the point of view as you would maybe ahead of maths at Key Stage 4, Key Stage 3.
Obviously, you've got a post-16 challenge advisor as well,
yes.
With secondary schools. The reassurance I'd offer, part of the discussion we had with Colleague Gwent, going right back, was that Council, and this is within the service area, want to give confidence that our learners are continuing to make progress, and we get equivalent data coming back to us to make sure we know the outcomes and the destinations for those learners going through tertiary when that happens in Torvine. And we have that undertaking from Colleague Gwent. We're formalising that within a partnership agreement with them. And the reassurance I would also offer is that in the preparations for the design of the curriculum offer at Colleague Gwent, all of our secondary schools have been involved in looking at what they're currently doing at GCSE, working with Sharon and colleagues from Colleague Gwent and helping design that, and making sure that because when tertiary happens, the relationship, it's the angels, the relationship that we continue to have is really important, because we want to make sure that A, we've got the right curriculum choices at Key Stage 3 and 4, that we've got meaningful pathways into A-level and other vocational pathways for those learners, and that relationship's actually growing ever stronger. And that's as much our business, even though Colleague Gwent might be taking over the responsibility for delivery, and Colleague Gwent will be very clear with us. They want to take part in all of the work we're currently doing and maintain that relationship with the, in a sense, with the feeder secondary schools. Because the model that we talked about in terms of cluster working, we're the cluster now for Colleague Gwent, in a sense. Yes. So all the principles that we've talked about through the business plan and the discussions today carry forward for that too.
Can I just add, in regards to us moving forward with our sixth form, with the Torvine Learning Zone, yes. As Dermot said, all our secondary schools, even the ones without the sixth form, are involved in the conversations. Those that have got sixth forms, they are currently, this term, it just started since January, having their open evenings where Colleague Gwent colleagues are going along to support. They've got leaflets, they've got various documentation that everybody's been working on, and they're there to support learners because it's critical for them. They're going to start their journey in one base, but finish it in another, and there's lots of questions. So they're supporting those now, and if you look on the website, you'll see the draft curriculum offer there. It's almost finalised, and also we're now working on the transition project to ensure that that transition is as smooth as we possibly can. It can be for those learners, and EAS will be involved in those discussions as well.
And I think just to finish, I know Dermot and Sharon attended as well. I mentioned the ALPS data because I think it's crucial that you're able to track the progress of your Torvine students through Colleague Gwent as well. And I know Dermot is looking at implementing that tracker across the piece. So you can be provided with a similar data as you would for your Key Stage 4 and so on, but based on your post-16 progression students as well, so that you can make those valued judgments about the provision for your Torvine pupils moving forward.
My last comments, which was not too much a question as a comment really, around the more able and talented, and obviously as we move towards the journey for every pupil, I think it would be quite interesting to see as EAS can support not just the academic talent as such. I've seen some of the cluster work we're doing, and they're going up to university and stuff and seeing around for the day, but we've also got really talented artists, sports stars of the future. Do you know what I mean? But I think there's a job work maybe in next year's plan that we might start to see some help there.
During this meeting is to gain your comments and feedback on the plan as it stands, and I think going forward, if that's something we've alluded to, like the cap 9 and it being an average point score, and so every grade counts in every subject, but that's not the same as talking about your really talented artists or your really talented musician, and it's something that we would welcome comments. and feedback.
Before we do go, I want to remind you, Julian said about governors and...
Right. What you're going to find increasing now, we're going to be offering a number of professional learning opportunities to brief members as well about the new developments, because obviously they're coming through thick and fast. But what you can expect to see coming soon, we're moving towards producing a school on a page, because what you're not going to have anymore, obviously, is figures aggregated up in comparative data above a school data level. So we're going to continue to track individual pupil level data and progress and school targets. So that will be available. And then we're going to try and produce from that a school on a page. So it'll be quite easy to look at it that way. And there'll be progress data, but it'll be based on individual pupil progress data. So it's not going to be high level, but it'll be there. And the other thing is, we are moving to a far more rigorous quality assurance of schools, self-evaluation and planning processes. And then actually, as part of the role of the CA and business-related staff, tracking progress against those. Because if a school, you'd like to think if the self-evaluation process is tight, it's highlighted the right things, they're now in the plan, well, how are we progressing that? So it's a way of making sure that we inform that moving forward, and we feel as a region that's probably the way things are going to move along the lines of categorisation and everything else in future as well. So just to make you aware, that we are looking at providing different forms of data to inform scrutiny and members of how well their schools are progressing. I won't use the word doing because we're all about progress now. So and hopefully making sure that it's in a form that you can use and interrogate yourselves, and then we'll provide the relevant professional learning for you to be able to do that once we learn how to do it ourselves. Not said to myself it was an expert.
Thank you very much for coming. You're now free to go, and we'll formulate some recommendations. Thank you very much. Okay, so if I just go over the scrutiny activity, just to remind everybody what our question was. So the report asks for members to consider the full contents of the draft plan. I can't read, I should put my glasses on. Through this activity, members will ensure that the plan enables appropriate support for schools to improve and that all pupils reach their potential across Torfaen. So basically, we're asked to comment on the contents of the business plan and offer any recommendations as we wish. So, anybody? I think I'd start with what you spoke about, Jess, about the alternative, supporting children, pupils, should I say, that might not necessarily go down the traditional routes. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you make a recommendation to what?
Shall I put the microphone on? I think the funding issues are a major concern. There's a deficiency in our secondary schools, and it's been proved today. On whether or not we're funding those schools appropriately or not, I don't know. It may be a timely manner, looking at the loss of our sixth forms, to actually look into the funding of our secondary schools. And the issue around the EAS only having funding on a yearly basis needs to be looked at as well.
Three things for me, Chair. First of all, I remain deeply concerned about performance at certain indicators such as level 2+. I mean, they couldn't answer that. You can't get away from it. 3 years I've asked it. 3 years they've not come up with any actual, tangible strategy for resolving that. And they talk about they talk about sort of improving picture. But if you're 16 years of age and just gone through the system for the last 4 years, actually it's not been improving for you. So I think I remain concerned about that. And it's all very well having having policies for improving access to higher education, but if you're not getting the GCSEs in the first place, that's not much use to actually. Secondly, I mean, they talk about they like to talk a lot about sort of cluster working with other schools across other authorities. But I mean, something which struck me, they talk about this SMID system you mentioned. Well, why didn't they come up with that? That's their job, isn't it? To recommend strategies and to recommend, why didn't you try this in this school? They're using this it works very well. And for every good system, which you obviously think is good, there's also one awful one. I come across one called Lysol, which is dreadful. So I think, just as a minor point, the other concern I have is I'm not sure how we can sit here and review their performance when we've not got any evidence of how they've been doing. And somebody else saying we're going to send it to you. Well, surely it should be part of the package, shouldn't it? I mean, how do I know what they've done last year? What have they done? I mean, how did it go? What went well, what didn't go well? I have no idea. So I remain concerned that there's no evidence of an evaluation procedure and an objective one as well.
I think, obviously they said, that it's difficult with changes, and they left it quite vague for that reason. But I do think they could tighten up their what they're looking for to evaluate, because at the moment, there's,
next year,
how will we say that they've achieved it or not?
Next year we'll sit down with this and the next one and go through it.
Can I agree with John? We had a session on the self-evaluation, and we were told hadn't been cleansed. It hadn't been cleansed, but it was going to come back, and we hadn't seen it. So how do we know that they have self-evaluated correctly, our officers in the LA, and it's fed into the EAS business plan? Another issue I've got is the acronyms that's been used just in today's meeting is unbelievable. I've heard SMID, I've heard PPL, I've heard MAT, I've heard EIB, LNS, ALPS, ALS, ELPS, and there's no explanation of what that means to a layman. If I was sitting at home reading the report, and without having the explanation or the ability to ask somebody, I think we need a glossary of terms of acronyms. And as an educationist, you tend to use these acronyms because they're so long and it's easier to use.
It is written for the cognoscenti, isn't it?
It is.
Well, it's not written for the parent.
No. And I think we need to, just watch the amount of acronyms that's being used, and actually, when it's first mentioned, please have an explanation of what it is. That you actually read it, and then when you further read it that it's actually there. So.
Further on to that one, I have noticed that when you read a lot of things, the first time they put them initials, they put by the side of it the name of it. Yeah. And I think that's what should have been done. Yeah. Rather than us ask all the time what it is. The first time it's mentioned in their report, right. Say like LEA or Local Education Authority, then from then on, then you can refer back to them without interrupting the meeting or anything.
They actually brought up there was the fact that they go to external bodies, right, with a range of worker practices. Well, that's what they're there for. So why should they be going out to external bodies? We'd have enough this in other areas. But that I think was, to me,
I'm often concerned when they use academics to produce reports, and if they market it as well. mentioned that before, and nothing's ever appeared, if I remember rightly. I'd be interested to know, they talk about early intervention. I'm wondering, how early did it need to be in Cwmbran High School's case, Should they have gone in, or should they have,
Should they have thought better about joining up to school and red school and early school?
Well, you talk about early intervention, that's not helped it there, is it, really?
The other thing that
For that. Okay, so item 6, date and time of the next meeting. It will be the 20th of March 2019, and it's focusing on the early year childcare pilot, so which we agreed at visioning. There's a pro forma. I'm not sure if everyone has had one, but quite a few people have. What's this form here? Talking about what we'll be looking at next time.
Early years.
Yeah.
And another one here?
Another one?
Oh, thank you. We're actually looking at childcare at early years and, early interventions.
As far as I know, this is just the childcare pilot, because it's being run separately. I'm seeing Dermot tomorrow, and we'll be having a discussion about what's happening, so we'll find out. See what, we'll arrange what's going on with. But
unless it was PERIC specifically,
so we'll see where the report's going on it. But for this one in particular, with this one we're looking at sort of obviously just the pilot really, how it's impacting and how people are using it. So we're asking if you've got any ideas for invitees, etc., to come in for this one. I think we've suggested somebody from Blaenau Gwent as their lead-in on the project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody from the parent panel?
Is there still an early years panel?
I'm not sure, that's why I've asked if we can have somebody who's, you know, a user of the
panel.
We can say about that, we work on any information we use, how it was working, how my staff was working, how she started working, what impact it's having on our, you know, targets on our schools. So we really do need that information.
Okay, so then, just see, I'm reading. Okay then, let's close the meeting. Thank you very much for coming.